How can it be that Germany still doesn't have a new government? Surely we had an election on the 23rd of February and elected Friedrich Merz as chancellor, didn't we? Well, no, that's not what happened, but to explain what did happen, I'm going to have to explain a bit about the electoral system. Germany is an example of a parliamentary democracy, which should be familiar to most Europeans, but it works very differently from, for example, a presidential democracy of the kind you may be used to if you are American. Basically, in the US system, the president is head of government and is more or less directly elected. Sure, there is an extra level here in the form of the electoral college, but in practice, voters do get the chance to vote for the person they think should be head of government. In addition to that, the US keeps the executive branch, that is, the president and the cabinet, completely separate from the legislative branch, that is, Congress. In theory, Congress enacts laws, the executive carries them out. That is, at any rate, how it's supposed to work. There's a lot of controversy at the moment over whether or not this separation of powers has broken down, with critics of the current administration alleging that the president is now effectively ruling by decree. That is not, however, the subject of this video. I'm only mentioning it now before you all tell me about it in the comments. In a parliamentary system like Germany's, most members of the executive branch are also members of the legislative branch. That is, it's usual for the head of government and the cabinet to be members of parliament. They don't have to be, but that's usually how it happens. In Germany, we, the voters, elect members to the Bundestag, which is the most important part of the legislative branch. Any person who can get the support of more than 50% of the Bundestag can be appointed chancellor, and then the chancellor appoints members of the cabinet. Typically, but not necessarily, the chancellor is the designated chancellor candidate of the largest political party in the Bundestag, and most cabinet members are members of the Bundestag. At any rate, the executive is directly answerable to the legislative and can do very little without its approval. Incidentally, while in English the word government can often be used loosely to refer to the entire system governing the country, the equivalent German word Regierung is normally used only in its narrower sense to refer only to the executive branch, the chancellor and the cabinet. In terms of actual elections, Germany has a system of proportional representation and more than two major political parties. What this means is that it is very rare for any one party to get 50% of the seats in the Bundestag. For example, of the 630 members of the current Bundestag, only 208 of them can be relied on to support Merz. That's about 33%. There are two options here. In theory, Merz could just hope that enough people from other parties support him so that he can lead a minority government. The preferred option, though, is to get a coalition agreement with at least one other party. A coalition involves a signed agreement on a compromise policy agenda. Parties seeking a coalition have to negotiate which policies of which parties the government will eventually adopt, and this means that all parties involved have to abandon some of their election promises. Since the election, a coalition treaty between the Union and the SPD has been agreed after weeks of, we are told, very intense discussions. The Union, incidentally, is not a single party. It consists of the CSU, which is represented only in Bavaria, and the CDU, which is represented everywhere except Bavaria. Since there is no state where both parties are represented, they are allowed to function in the Bundestag as a single parliamentary group, and this one is called the Union. It usually looks and acts like a single party, but is in fact two. And that's significant because while the coalition agreement has been signed, it still has to be ratified by all three parties individually. And so far, the only party that has ratified it is the CSU. The SPD and the CDU are expected to ratify it at the end of this month, and in the case of the SPD, this means the entire party membership voting on it. And this is where things might get a bit tricky. The Union and the SPD have traditionally always been the biggest parties in the Bundestag, with Merz's Union being mainstream right-wing and the SPD being mainstream left-wing. We've had Union-SPD coalitions before, known as Grand Coalitions. They've previously worked quite well. But that was back when Germany had relatively few problems and the emphasis was on keeping things going more or less as they were. In hindsight, that may have been a mistake, but at the time it seemed like the right thing to do. However, things are a bit different now, and as Merz has rightly pointed out, with this coalition representing just 52% of the Bundestag, it's not really accurate to call it a grand coalition. But more importantly, the country is now facing a lot of very serious issues, and the parties have radically different ideas about how to address them. About the only thing they agree on is their desire to keep the AfD out of government. That's why talks were so intense, and at one point they almost broke down completely. And there is a lot of dissatisfaction within the party's wider memberships. The youth wing of the SPD has already rejected it, saying that the SPD has given too much ground on migration and social policies. The youth wing of the CDU is also very unhappy about it, saying that the Union has given way too much ground on everything else. So we don't know yet whether this treaty will even be ratified. If it's not, then Merz may have to decide whether he wants to risk a minority government or risk a coalition with the AfD. And if those options fail, then we may have to vote all over again. But if the coalition agreement is ratified, then the next step will be for the Bundestag to elect the chancellor, who will almost certainly be Friedrich Merz. And this is expected to happen on the 6th of May. Until then, the previous cabinet remains in office as a caretaker government. And that means that despite the election, Olaf Scholz is still Chancellor and will remain Chancellor until the 6th of May at the earliest. Have a new government. Surely we had an election on the 23rd of February in all practicals, but members of the executive branch are usually